Okay, let's begin by singing the middle border or the middle states.
In the middle of the United States, in the middle of the United States, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Kansas and Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois. In the middle of the United States, in the middle of the United States, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Kansas and Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, Iowa, Missouri, and Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Kentucky, Indiana, Kentucky, Illinois. In the middle of the United States, in the middle of the United States.
Alright, so far Julie and Liza have started, we'll just go over the route that they've traveled so far. They started here in Mississippi, followed the Mississippi River up to Tennessee, to the border in Tennessee, and then they traveled east until they reached the Appalachian Mountains, and from there they traveled pretty much north through Tennessee, through Kentucky, up to, they have made it to Cincinnati. Now they crossed the Ohio River, and they've made it into Cincinnati, and that is where today's story begins. Okay, so what are some of the difficulties that Julie and Liza have run into so far getting into Canada, or traveling to Canada, trying to get to Canada? Will they get to Canada? And if they do get there, what will life be like there? So you can pause the video and you can answer those questions however you think that they should be, or the answers to them. Alright, chapter 17 is where we begin. In their new sweaters with knitted caps that matched, Julie and Liza were put inside a black horse-drawn carriage which had been waiting on the street before the large coffin home. Black curtains hung about its windows, as though a death were being hidden someplace inside. Aunt Katy clasped both girls in her arms. Levi Coffin searched their faces. His blue eyes glowed, warm and steady, as the light from a pine-knot ember. "God bless you both," he said, and closed the carriage door. The girls were not alone inside. Perhaps the other slaves had gone ahead. Sorry, I read that wrong. The girls were alone inside. Perhaps the other slaves had gone ahead, or were waiting in another hiding place. Julie and Liza sat close together, looking like strangers to each other, even in the closeted light. Julie had never felt the warmth of new clothes. They hugged against her. It was pleasant, and she smiled. She and Liza didn't look like slaves now. Would anyone know them, even if the door were flung wide open and mean old Sims stood scowling right before them? Rain pattered against the carriage top. The wheels sloshed through puddles, but the rain was welcome. It was a curtain of protection. "It feels safe and strong again, Julie," Liza hummed the words, "and I feels like a fine, cleaned-up lady." Julie squeezed her hand. The carriage jolted steadily through the streets, and the girls jolted with it, side by side. It was a short trip, for the driver could be heard calling to his horse, and the carriage began to skid as he pulled in the reins. They heard what must be their driver talking to another man. "A friend with friends," he said. "And what do you want sent by freight?" another man asked. "2 packages of dry goods," was the answer. "Drive to the end of the train station and we'll load them to the last freight car." The carriage began jogging again. When it stopped, the blurred figure of a man opened the carriage door. He was stocky with large, strong arms. "You must crawl inside one of these sacks," he said gently, tossing 2 gunny sacks into the carriage and closing the door. But he continued speaking. "You can breathe through the sacks and stretch around a bit when we put you in the freight car. Hang limp when we carry you." The girls stepped inside the sacks and began pulling them over their bodies and then over their heads. Outside they could hear the hissing steam of the train engine and the bang and shove of heavy freight cars. "I don't like being tied in a sack, Julie," Liza scowled, and there was a look of terror in her eyes. But she pulled the harsh cloth over her head and sat waiting in the carriage seat. Julia did the same. The driver opened the door and crawled inside. He tied each sack tightly at the top. Then he picked up Liza and handed her to his waiting helper outside. "Make yourself as small as possible," he told Julia, "and I will carry you over my shoulder." Julia knew if she stretched out, she would be twice as long as Liza. She held together as best as she could. A swirling sound of people and train noises, together with the drip of steady rain, surrounded Julia. She felt the arms of the driver tighten around her. A voice cried out above the confusion, "Search all those cars for runaway slaves!" Julia's heart pounded. She was glad for the sack, and glad for the protecting arms around her. "2 packages of dry goods go in this car," she heard another voice call. She was lifted into the car and carried far back into what must have been a dark corner. She was placed next to the sack that was Liza. "Don't move and don't talk until the train starts," the driver said softly. "You're going to Cleveland. A friend of the runaways of the Underground Railroad will meet you there. It's best you stay in the sacks until you reach your destination. But I'll loosen the top so you can stick your heads out for the trip." He pulled the cloth down from the girls' heads, but it was so dark they could barely see each other. The car began to move, and the man left quickly. There was a screech and the banging of a door. Wheels creaked and rolled underneath them. The car jerked, and the girls fell against each other. A bell clanged. The train was frightening with its strange urgency. The wheels turned faster and then faster, clicking over the long silver track. Julia pictured it in her mind. It would look like the track they had walked along in the state of Kentucky. The sound and the speed of the wheels began humming inside Julia's head. She felt dizzy. Liza groaned each time the big empty freight car rattled and jerked. Julia grew thirsty. Her mouth was dry and her tongue felt thick. She began to think about the rain outside and how she wanted it to pound over the car and wash down over her. She leaned against Liza. "Julie," Liza mumbled, "I think my bones has come loose and is rattling around in this sack." Julia had no answer. The train rattled on and on. It was going on forever, she began to think, and with all this speed it might fly right off the tracks. Julia forgot about a destination and that sometime the train would have to stop. She dozed off to sleep for a time, and was surprised when their freight car banged into the car ahead of them, and the rhythm of the wheels became slower and slower, and then stopped. "Liza!" Julia cried out in alarm, feeling her friend's body slumped against her legs. "I'm not dead," Liza groaned. "I just can't sit up." In the middle of the car, a light appeared. The door of the car slowly opened, and a wild whip of cold, fresh air blew in around them. "I am seeking 2 parcels of dry goods shipped to me from Cincinnati," a familiar voice called out. "I will take care of their transfer aboard the schooner Mayflower personally." Julia remembered. The voice belonged to Massa Ross from Canada. He must have escaped from jail. He had come, as he promised, to take them into the land of freedom. "Ah, here they are," he cried. He leaned over the girls without speaking, and quickly tied the sacks over their heads. And then he picked up a girl in each strong arm and strode from the car. Within minutes, he lifted them into a carriage with heavy drawn curtains. He untied the sacks at once and pulled the girls free from them. Liza fell onto the floor. She was too twisted and bent to sit on the seat. Julia stooped to lift her and came face to face with Massa Ross. But was it Massa Ross? He had no beard. His hair was dark red, but shorter. His chest and stomach were puffed out, round and full as before, but the clothes that covered him were plain. The ruffled shirt was gone. He rubbed his smooth chin and his eyes crinkled with laughter. "Julia and Liza!" His voice was muffled, but still lofty, as though he might be preaching a sermon. "Praise God that you have overcome innumerable hardships, and now are on the very brink of freedom." "A drink, Massa Ross?" Julia could barely manage the words. Her voice had the dryness of dust on the Mississippi road to the cotton fields. "My dear children!" The large man heaved himself down to a bag at his feet. He pulled out a bottle and unscrewed a cap. Water gurgled into a cup. "Liza first," Julia said. Mr. Ross held Liza upright and lifted the cup to her lips. "Drink slowly, child," he said. "When your body has been drained of moisture, it cannot stand the shock of unlimited amounts." Soon the cup came to Julia. The moisture cooled her lips. She held the liquid in her mouth. It trickled down her throat, and she swallowed twice, greedily. "There will be more when you board the Mayflower." Mr. Ross bent down and returned the bottle to the leather bag. Now that her mind was released from the dreadful thirst, Julia realized that the carriage was moving. She could see only the outlines of Mr. Ross's face in the seat opposite her and Liza. Eliza clutched the seat with both hands, struggling painfully to straighten her back. "Freedom ain't easy, Massa Ross." Eliza sounded again like the sullen, angry girl of the long-ago slave cabin on the Riley plantation. "Even you got put into jail, and your face don't look so well." Mr. Ross was weary. He leaned his head back against the carriage seat. "They had to release me when the slave whose disappearance caused my trial returned. He came into the courtroom just when I was about to be condemned." Mr. Ross spoke again, but quieter this time. "Injustice is the weapon of evil men, but there are always brave and noble souls who proceed on the course of right and are impervious to the consequences. I feel rewarded for all my efforts just to free the two of you." Julia was pleased with the ring of his words. Whatever Massa Ross was saying, it helped her lift her head, straighten her back, and think of Mammy Sally, who never bent low to anyone. Julia thought back to the hot day in the cotton fields when Massa Ross marched down the rows and chose Lester and then Adam to be his guides. Lester and Adam. Why hadn't she and Liza asked about them right away? Massa Ross would know where they were. "Massa Ross," Julia blurted out in a jumble of fear and hope, "did Lester and Adam get to Canada?" Mr. Ross leaned forward slowly. "They reached Canada, all right," he said. "They both know freedom." He paused. "Lester has a job in the town of St. Catharines. He wants both of you to come there." Adam died. There was a shocked moment of silence. Kind, gentle Adam. Julia felt the dryness again in her throat, but this time there was throbbing pain. Liza bent forward, straightening her crippled back, her eyes filled with tears, which ran freely over her scarred black cheeks. "How did he die, Massa Ross?" she asked. Mr. Ross's shoulders slumped. "It was the chains." His voice was husky. "They were too tight and cut through the flesh. When we filed them off, there was blood poisoning. Adam lived in Canada only one day. We buried him under a tall pine tree." There was nothing more to say. The evil chains. Julia felt herself wanting to pry them apart forever, to strain every muscle in her body, to pull every chain loose from the legs and arms and necks of every slave. The carriage stopped, and Julia wiped the tears from her face with the sleeve of her newly knitted sweater. Before she heard about Adam, Julia was going to ask Massa Ross if he had seen a tall, black-skinned woman with a proud walk who went by the name of Mammy Sally. Now she was afraid to know. The carriage jolted. The door opened, and the girls with Mr. Ross stepped into a dusky, lead-gray street. It was evening. To be safe, they pulled their new hats far down over the blackness of their faces. They tucked their hands under the warmth of the wisteria blue sweaters. Before them was a vast, gray stretch of water. It didn't have the sound of the rolling Mississippi. The water heaved and pushed toward the shore, and then splashed in one long row of waves. Great hulks of boats, anchored along its sides, rocked with the rhythm of the moving water. On one of the largest, the sails were being pulled aloft. "That one is the Mayflower, the abolition boat," Mr. Ross said. "It will take you across Lake Erie to Canada under its waving sails." "Then you aren't coming with us?" Julia faced him soberly. Mr. Ross heaved his great shoulders and breathed long and deep and full in the vastness of his chest. "I must return again to the South and free more of your people," he said. He picked up the skimpy bundles from the carriage floor and walked toward the boat. "Keep your caps pulled down and don't raise your heads to look at anyone," Mr. Ross turned and whispered to the girls. With those new clothes, a passerby would think you were my children. It's fortunate the day is gray and cloudy." It was only a few steps to the boat, and at once Mr. Ross began shaking the hand of a man he called the captain. Mr. Ross didn't raise his voice, with his usual flourish, but spoke quietly. "A friend with friends," he said at first. "The magic password of the Underground Railroad." Julia felt warm and excited each time she heard it. "These are my children," Mr. Ross continued. "Take them safely to Fort Malden." The captain was a jolly man, with a hat cocked to one side of his head. "Aye, that I will." He hung onto each word with peals of laughter. "Come with me, lads, to your bunks below." Mr. Ross patted each girl gently on the shoulder and bade them goodbye. He disappeared into the gray evening dusk. Julia and Liza wanted to call out to thank this big, kind man, but both of them knew the need for silence. It would be dangerous, too, for them and for Mr. Ross if they lifted their heads and showed their black faces. The girls walked aboard the Mayflower with the captain. Julia felt the boat must be breathing, and that she was walking over its body. It went up and down with each rise and fall of the waves beneath it. They followed the captain down a narrow flight of stairs, and then walked along a corridor with tiny doors on either side. At one of them they stopped. The captain opened the door to a little room. It was hardly big enough for the three of them to stand inside. Two beds seemed to hang on the side of the wall, and a small round window looked out on the water. "I know you are lassies," the captain laughed again, "but for this trip you will be laddies to me and me mates." He showed the girls how to lock their door, and warned them to open it only when they heard 3 knocks, and then the words, "A friend with friends." He would bring them food and water at once. Then they were to crawl into their beds and sleep with all their clothing on. "If all goes well," the captain smiled broadly beneath his thick black mustache, "we will reach the banks of Canada in the early morning light." The R's in his speech trilled together like the song of a bird. Julia thought she would have no trouble recognizing his voice behind a door that was closed. The captain bent down and walked out of the little door. The girls locked it behind him. Chapter 18. There was barely time for Julia and Liza to look about the cabin when 3 raps were heard on the door, and the captain's voice whispered, "A friend with friends. Open the door, laddies. There's trouble aboard." Julia turned the lock. The captain's face puffed with anger. "I've had word there's a slave hunter and sheriff coming aboard, with a warrant to search the schooner before we sail." He peered closely at the girls. "I have a notion that you're the lassies they're making all the stir about." He picked up their bundles and hurried them out of the door. They ran down the narrow corridor and up the winding stairs. It was nearly dark on the open deck. Firefly-looking lanterns bobbed here and there. The wind was full of the smell of fish, and it was cold. The girls ran with the captain across the deck to the far side of the schooner, where a little lifeboat, covered with canvas, hung against the side. The captain pulled back the canvas and helped Julia and Liza inside. "You will find blankets, water, and a bite of food in there. Take care and pray that the good Lord will protect ye." He pulled down the canvas and left them alone. The girls shivered. They felt about for the blankets and crawled under them, partly for warmth and partly for protection. "We're going to jump into the water," Julia said solemnly, "if that sheriff comes near this little boat and takes the canvas off the top." Liza clutched Julia's shoulder. "We're never going back to being slaves again." It was a pledge between them. They were near the end of their journey. Master Ross had said that Canada and freedom were on the other side of Lake Erie. There was no more walking through the woods, or climbing mountains, or hiding in wet swamp water. "After all our trials, Liza," Julia said slowly, "anything is better than going back to slavery." There was a small opening between the canvas and the top of their little boat, and the girls found that by looking through it, they could see onto the deck. People walked aboard with baskets and bundles in their arms. Sailors pulled at ropes and lifted rolls of heavy white cloth. Near the plank where the people came on board, the captain stood scowling, his cap still pulled down over one eye, and his mustache looked stiff and forbidding. The girls kept their eyes on him. 2 large men shoved their way up the plank and approached him. They could be the sheriff and the slave hunters. Julia didn't know. They had never seen them before. The men spoke to the captain, waving their arms in his face and pacing impatiently up and down beside him. They seemed like horses pawing the ground, wanting some kind of action. But the words they spoke were lost to Liza and Julia in the wind and the splashing noise of lapping water. The captain shook his head. He threw his arms into the air as if in despair. He walked toward the thin stairway. The big men followed. "They're going to search the cabins, Liza," Julia gasped, realizing how lucky their escape had been. "We're going to get to Canada if we've got to hang onto the bottom of this boat and get pulled across Lake Erie." Julia was angry now. What right had these men to keep chasing them right up to the border, as if they were 2 runaway dogs? She and Liza were not going to be slaves no more. It was night now. The gray fringes of daylight had slipped from the sky. Dark clouds foamed and raced above the Mayflower. Then they parted, and a half-moon dazzled the schooner with yellow light. The North Star shone above with radiant steadiness. A bell clanged, and the boat swayed impatiently, as though eager to break away from the shore. The captain and the 2 large men popped out of the stairway. They heaved and puffed and ran to the entrance plank. They shook their fists in the captain's face, but he shoved them onto the plank and waved goodbye. The Mayflower turned. It swung around into the wind. The sails high above began cutting through the water. I feel that I'm flying through the sky just like those sails." Liza hugged Julia as they both pushed a wider opening into the canvas so they could see more of the outside. The joy that Julia felt was so intense that there was pain around her heart. "Liza," Julia said finally, "Mammy Sally's watching that same North Star. I've got to keep myself from hoping too much, but I'm hoping that it's led her to freedom too." Liza began feeling about for the bundle of food and the flask of water. The girls ate and drank all of it. They drew pillows. They drew blankets close around them and then watched the billowing sails catch the rushing wind. Without wanting to, they slept in the hollow shelter of the small lifeboat. When the captain found them later, peaceful and warm, he left them to rock through the night and be refreshed for the morning. A crisp, bright morning came quickly with thin white frost powdering the deck. The air was strong with fresh fish smells. They mixed with the land smells of pine and pungent walnut bark and fertile earth still warm from summer. The waves on Lake Erie lapsed into gentle ripples. Sails were pulled in and the Mayflower drifted ashore. Julie and Liza woke with the sudden stillness of the schooner's landing. They grasped each other's hand for comfort, at once remembering the Mayflower, Lake Erie, and their nearness to Canada. They pushed up the canvas on their little boat, and the bright sun showered over them. The captain ran toward them, shouting with his trilling R's and upturned voices. "Ahoy!" He waved for the girls to join him. "All passengers ashore!" He grabbed the girls by their arms and ushered them down the plank to the shoreline. He pointed to rows of tall, silent trees and the long, bleak shore. "See those trees?" he shouted. "They grow on free soil." Julie and Liza ran down the plank and jumped to the ground. "Canada?" they cried together. The captain nodded. Liza dropped to her knees. She spread out her arms and kissed the ground. "Bless the Lord, I'm free!" she cried. Julie stood as tall and straight as she could. She pulled the cap from her head and held her head high. There was no longer any need to hide her black skin. She was Julie, a free person. She was not a slave. "Thank you, Lord," she said aloud. She filled her lungs as full as she could with the air of this new free land. No one else was near them except the captain. He was wiping tears from his eyes and blowing his nose. But he seemed nervous and jumpy, and kept watching each passenger who walked from the schooner. "Ye are safe now," he said warmly to the girls, "and it does me heart good to have brought ye here." Then he lowered his voice. "But you must remember that I must go back to Ohio this very day. I can't be getting myself arrested for helping slaves escape to freedom, and I can't be revealing that I'm a conductor on the Underground Railway, even though my part of the train goes on top of the water." He laughed suddenly. Julie looked at the captain with great admiration. In her great joy to be standing on the soil of Canada, she had forgotten how this man was risking his job, and maybe his life, to bring them across Lake Erie on the Mayflower. "Liza and I will never forget how you and all the people of the Underground Railway helped us, Captain," Julia said. She wanted to give him something, but her bundle was limp and empty. Liza seemed not to hear them. She was still kneeling on the ground praying. "I'm giving ye a little money from Mr. Ross," said the captain, awkwardly shoving some paper bills into Julia's hand. "Far down the shore there is a colored man with a cart waiting to take ye and your friend to the town of St. Catharines. Mr. Ross arranged it. Your cousin Lester has a job in that town, and he'll take care of ye for a bit." Julia looked quickly down the long stretch of rocks and sand that ran beside the lapping blue water of the great Lake Erie, and sure enough, there was a man with a cart waiting beside one of the roads. Chapter 19, the last chapter in the book. The captain turned swiftly and ran back to his schooner. Small clusters of people gathered here and there along the quiet shore, but Julia felt no need to be greeted by anyone. She began to hum softly as the words rang in her head. "Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home." Julie walked toward Liza and shook her gently on the shoulder. "You can't just sit here praying for the rest of your life, Liza," Julie laughed with a full, strong voice. "We've a ways to go yet, and there's a man right up there waiting to take us there." Liza seemed dazed, but she stood without help from Julie, and the two of them walked silently round the shoreline toward the colored man, whose wagon was hitched to an aged brown horse. As they neared him, he seemed to recognize them as his passengers and stood waving them toward him. Liza drew back. "We'd best hide in those bushes, Julie, until it's dark. What's he mean, letting everyone see him waving at us?" "Liza," Julie shook her friend again, "we are in Canada, and we are free, and free means not having to hide no more." Liza stopped in shocked amazement, as though this new idea struck her like a bolt of lightning. "You is right, Julie," Liza said, and her back seemed to straighten a little, with almost no expression of pain on her face. "We can walk right up to that cart and climb on board and lift up our heads, just like the white people always do." The kindly brown-skinned driver climbed down and held out both his hands. He was tall and strong, and his hair bushed out from his head like a gray and black speckled frame. "Ah, Messer Wilson," he said, smiling as though the sun had lighted his face with a spark. Master Ross sent word you were coming, and Lester said I was to bring you right to him in St. Catherine's." He reached for Julia's hand, and then Liza's, and held them tight. The girls were speechless, until Liza's sullen eyes suddenly sparkled. "I was sort of expecting that Queen Victoria herself might be marching up and down this shore when we arrived," she said. "But I think, Ezra Wilson, that you look just as good." Ezra Wilson chuckled, but continued to hold their hands. "I know how you feel," he nodded quietly. "I came here last year, just like you, at the time of the harvest." "We'd best not talk now." The tall, strong man turned from them and began to busy himself with the fresh straw and blankets in the back of the cart. "It's a 2-day trip to St. Catherine's. We'll have plenty of time to say a good many things by then." The girls climbed into the cart and settled themselves on the straw. It was too warm for the blankets now. The morning sun had a soothing warmth. There was a burnished glow about it, like the ripened skin of a red apple. Ezra Wilson sat above them and flicked the reins for the horse to go. The cart began to jog up a steep road, lined on either side by tall green pines. The 2 days of travel along the country roads of the Upper Canada with kindly Ezra Wilson were a time of peace and quiet joy for Julia and Liza. At first, they covered themselves with the blankets when other people came their way. But no one stopped them, and no one shouted, and when they came to small towns and were hungry, they walked into the stores and brought food with the money Master Ross had given them. At night, when the sun disappeared, they fell to the hard cold of this new north country. Then the blankets warmed them, and they were never afraid. On the second morning, the leaves on the trees beside the jogging cart were yellow gold. Ezra Wilson stopped and spread a blanket beneath them, and they ate their lunch. "It's like heaven here," Liza murmured softly. Ezra Wilson stood up abruptly. "No, it isn't heaven," he said curtly, "and I've got to tell you how it is." He looked at the girls a long time, and then continued. "We colored folks in St. Catherine's work hard, very hard, but we've got food to eat, and most of us have a warm, dry place to live." Julia looked at him with apprehension. What else did he have to tell them to let them know that Canada wasn't just a place with yellow gold leaves? Ezra continued to stand. His face was stern, but he didn't raise his voice. "We found jobs," he said, "but none of us can read, and all the white folks can." "Read?" Julia asked, never having thought in all her life that she might ever learn to read. "It seems, Liza and Julia, that the white folks don't want us in their schools." Ezra's voice grew sad. "There's a St. Paul's Ward School in St. Catherine's for the colored, and a St. Paul's Ward School for the whites, and the white school's got more books, and more paper, and more desks, and a good strong building." "But can we go to school and learn to read?" Julia's eyes grew round with wonder. "Would that somebody like me come?" Liza lifted herself painfully to look up into the face of tall Ezra Wilson. "I'm learning." Ezra smiled down at her and rubbed his gray flecked hair. "Now, I guess I'll just end all this warning talk by saying that I made up my mind that salt and potatoes in Canada are better than pound cake and chickens in a state of worry and suspense in the United States. Now, let's eat lunch." While he talked, Julia remembered what Master Ross had told them a long time ago in Mississippi, that escaping into Canada would be hard, and that living in Canada would be hard too. But it didn't seem to hurt to remember this. She and Liza could work, and salt and potatoes weren't bad for eating when no slave owner was around to threaten or whip. One night, Ezra Wilson talked about St. Catherine's, how Lester worked there as a porter in the Welland House Hotel, where a special pipe brought magic mineral water to all the guests. He told how former slaves helped to build the hotel, and how many of them work there now. "It's a grand place." Ezra spread his long arms wide and high. "A big porch runs along the front of it, and all the fine people sit there rocking away in their chairs." Julia and Liza were excited, and yet worried about arriving in the town. They talked continually to one another in the jogging wagon. How would it be to live in a town and not be a slave? How would Lester look? If only Adam had lived to welcome them too. Julia yearned to ask Ezra Wilson if he had seen or ever heard of a handsome black woman called Mammy Sally, but she didn't dare. As long as no one had heard of her, there was always hope that she would come to Canada. But if they did know, and something bad had happened to her, Julia wanted to put off the knowing of it as long as she could. On the morning of the third day, Ezra told them that the town they were coming to was St. Catherine's. At first, it looked like the other villages they had traveled through. There were large and small houses, mostly built of brick. Trees and shrubs and flowers grew everywhere. But on the streets of St. Catherine's were many black folks just like them. When they came to the part of the town where the shops were, they saw many more. They ain't dressed fancy, Liza said to Lily, but they ain't wearing rags. At the end of the street, they saw a tall, two-story building with a wide porch running across the front of it, the Warland House Hotel. Ezra pulled in the reins to slow the horse. In front of the hotel stood a light-skinned colored man with freckles. He wore a tight suit that buttoned up the front with shining gold buttons. "It's Lester!" Julia shouted. She jumped from the wagon and ran toward him. Lester grabbed both her hands in his and looked at her fondly. Julia searched his face. Lester was well and content, but the anger was still in his eyes, and the pride was still in his high-held head. Julia was glad. The beatings and chains hadn't crushed him down like a snake. Together they saw Liza trying to crawl over the back of the wagon. Lester ran toward her and picked her up in his arms. The three of them stood together for a moment in a tight, happy circle. Tall, kind Ezra Wilson joined them. Then Lester placed Liza gently on the dirt road beneath them. As he did so, he glanced toward a door at the far end of the hotel. "You'll want to see her right away in the kitchen, Julie," Lester said. Her? Kitchen? Julie was puzzled. Was it someone wanting to give her a job in the kitchen? "It's a surprise I planned for you, Julie," Lester said. "I made Ezra promise not to tell." Angry, hostile Lester became surprisingly sheepish. A woman opened the far back door. Julie stared. She was tall and dark-skinned, with a white kerchief about her head. But her hair was gray. Her face was wrinkled. She was old. Then the woman came toward them, limping, but with long, full strides. "Mammy Sally!" Julie cried, and ran into her mother's outstretched arms. "Child, child," Mammy Sally sang the words over and over again. Finally, she held Julie at arm's length. Her eyes were radiant. "June Lily, you have grown." She looked again with grave concern. "You have become a woman." Julie didn't hear. Being with Mammy Sally again was like shifting a 100-pound sack of cotton from her back and just taking on a 2-pound load instead. But it also filled her heart with such a joy that she wanted to shout and sing. Instead, Julie put a strong arm around her mother to support her. "How did you know, Mammy? How did you know to come out that door and meet me?" she asked. "Land, child, didn't Massa Ross tell you I was here? Or did Lester keep it a secret from him, too?" Mammy Sally laughed, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Julie remembered Liza. She led her mother to the hunched, thin girl who stood quietly on the road. "Liza came with me," Julia said simply to Mammy Sally. "We are like sisters." Mammy Sally touched Liza gently on the head. "You gonna live with us, Liza? I'm buying us a little house." She stood proud and tall before all of them. "We'll walk there now." They all started walking down the wide dirt road. Liza, Julia, and Mammy Sally in the lead, with Lester and Ezra behind them. "We are free and we are together," Mammy Sally almost sang the words. Then she paused and looked long and joyfully at the strangely dressed girls beside her. She started walking again and said, "Freedom isn't easy. We black folks can't read and we can't write, and the white people in St. Catharines don't want us in their schools. We are poor, but we are building us a church and building us a school. We are poor, but we get paid for the jobs we do. We are poor, but some of us are building houses on the land we own. We are poor, but none of us is slaves." Mammy Sally's words became a song. There was a rhythm and a rising cadence to each new line. They all began marching toward a grove of tall pine trees. Julia glanced at her mother's face. It had deep wrinkles. The hair that shone beneath her kerchief was powdery white with specks of gray. There were scars on Mammy's neck. She'd been lashed with a whip. She limped when she walked, but her head was high, and her voice rang with courage and deep joy. Julia put a strong arm around her mother to support her. She pulled Liza along with her other hand. Mammy Sally needed her. Liza and Lester needed her. She was growing up. There was a lot for her to do in this great new land of freedom. The end. Alright, so pause the video for a little bit and make a list of all the hiding places that Julia and Liza used when they were escaping. See how many of you can list? Alright, so here are a couple of them. Barn with the hay and straw. They hid in a wagon with hay or straw. Swamp water. A cave. On top of the roof at Jed Brown's house. In hidden rooms on the Underground Railroad. between the straw tick and the feather tick, in gunny sacks, in a drawer in the wagon under the cart, and also in the lifeboat on the schooner, the Mayflower. So again, what were some of the difficulties that the runaways faced when they arrived in Canada? So pause the video and see how many of those you can list. Obviously some of those would have been they couldn't read or write, they had to go to separate schools, and they couldn't make as much money. There were some other things as well. They were free, and they still faced some discrimination. People still looked down on them, but the lives they lived in Canada were much better than being slaves. So, and that wraps it up for today. See you tomorrow.